Sometimes when we read the Old Testament, it looks like it's anti-women, it's anti-slaves, it's anti-Gentiles, it's racist. It can look like that. Unless you read the Old Testament the way it was intended to be read, which is in context. So there's a number of things that we need to know which are a part of this big word that Christians use, Christian theologians use, which is called hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is how we read, understand and apply the Bible. Now, this becomes particularly tricky when you're dealing with the Old Testament, because the Old Testament has lots of sacrificial laws, it has lots of priestly rituals, it has the story of a people that move out of one country into another land that's already possessed by people who are treated as if they're invaders themselves. So when we can get the context and we can understand some of the Old Testament, we can better understand what it's actually saying and how it applies to us today, because a lot of it doesn't apply to us today, but there's a whole section of the whole chunk of it that runs through it which has to do with morality, how you treat people, and that really does apply to us today. So let's take one of those things. Let's take how the Bible treats women, how the Bible addresses the topic of women. Of course, we could look at the Old Testament and think that women were treated as inferior, but the reality is that's not the case. For example, in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we have the progression of creation. It's set as having happened over 6 consecutive periods of time, with a 7th period of time being added to it, known as a time of rest, which marks our 7-day week, where the 7th was meant to be a time of rest. And so in this progression of creation, we see it go from simple to complex. We see it go from good to really good, or as the Bible itself says, very good. And so when you look at that, we see that man, as in Adam, was created on the 6th day, and then after that, Eve was created. And if we're seeing the pattern, the progression, we're seeing that God created Adam, and then he created Eve with a capacity that Adam didn't have, and that is to be a life source. So there are some scriptures, even in the New Testament. Let's have a look at some of those. So for example, in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 22, it says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." And this can sound like wives are subject to their husbands in the sense that they have no say, they have no rights at all. But the previous verse and verses talk about submit one to another. So there's a sense in which there's mutual submission, but there's a place where somebody's got to make the call, and in a marriage, the husband is to bear that kind of responsibility. It's not a matter of more rights or anything like that. When we see in the New Testament in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 11, "Let a woman learn with all submissiveness." Again, we take the context there that the Bible also talks about women prophesying. The Bible talks about women ministering. So when we take a verse in isolation outside of its context, it can sound like something that the overall message of Scripture doesn't say. When we read in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 12, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet." And verse 13, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve." And so it sounds like there's something going on in this local context where some of those women were being disruptive, and Paul is addressing that. And the reason we know that is because this instruction is not repeated anywhere else in the New Testament to any other church apart from this church, which was the church at Ephesus, where it was being addressed. We see in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 8, it says, "For man was not made from woman, but woman from man." And verse 9 it says, "Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man." And again, for the man to protect, the man to guard, the man to look after, not to dominate over. And so Scripture teaches that God also gifts women with various gifts. And if women weren't expected to use these gifts, this is a rather odd thing for God to do. So we see that God gifts in Acts chapter 2 verse 17, where Peter stands on the day of Pentecost And he says, and in these last days it shall be, he's quoting from Joel the prophet, God declares that I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. So we see that when we take everything in context, that Scripture doesn't subjugate women, it doesn't deny them of their rights. In fact, it upholds them as equal, created in the image of God. That's through the Old Testament. We see examples of this where Abraham is told, listen to your wife. Listen to her, do what she says. And we have other examples where God is showing that he redeems through the life source, through women. Women are often the life source of redemption, and this occurs through the Old Testament. So as we read the Old Testament, let's be careful to read out of it and not into it.